Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Q&A for part one of the Compass. So this is just sort of an introduction to the archived version and something that will help clarify a little bit of what's going on at the beginning of the video, which is that Jonathan Blow was restreaming the lecture and then provided some kind of additional commentary and clarification points on some things from the lecture, and some of those I thought were very useful, and I also responded to in my own Q&A. So in order to have the context to understand what I'm even saying, I've decided to include those discussion points at the beginning of the Q&A here. So hopefully that helps both understanding the course and understanding some of the responses that I have in the Q&A. All right.
Okay, so, but we got some ideas of things to talk about that are really, these are just my own thoughts on related stuff. So one is Demakes. You know, he suggested that as a way, you know, again, to paraphrase, I think he was saying, if you're getting into game design and you don't exactly have ideas, Demakes is one way to do it. It's true because Demakes are very accessible. Wait, did this go live? Okay. We'll hang out here. Be sure to go to this channel and like and subscribe. Oh wait, it's my channel on this channel. Oh no. Okay. Anyway, so the danger of Demakes is the following. Well, okay, the good thing, let's talk about why Demakes are good, is because it provides idea fuel, right? It gives you something to do without having to like have some rocket sciencey like amazing idea. It's like, oh, I like this game. I've seen other Demakes. They have like pixel art and whatever. And I feel like it would be cool to do that. And that's all true. And it can be good. Just doing a demake can be good, either design practice or programming practice or whatever you want it to be, right? The danger, on the other hand, is that like at some point, if you don't find a little bit of magic sauce, if you don't find the reason why that demake of that game is good, then your demake is essentially kind of the same game as every other demake, right? And unless you find a way for the reduced fidelity and the simplicity of whatever to highlight something about the game or to bring a new idea in or something like that, right? So this is the thing. Okay, what is a demake, right? Usually it has worse graphics and usually it has well, let's just say overall a lesser technical implementation, and then also a simplified version of the design. You're not implementing the full game, you're implementing something about it usually, right? And not always, general rule. But the thing about that is, by not implementing the full design of the game, it does give you the ability to focus on some part of the game and then take it in a slightly different direction. And that could be a really fruitful way to think about things. But the danger is if you just think that like, oh, I'm going to make a demake of this game and it's just got worse graphics and therefore it's better because it's mine. That doesn't quite work, right? And so you've just got to make sure to use that opportunity to turn on your creative brain and like have a little bit of a spark, right? That's all. Okay. But sometimes, you know, I mean, again, so what are examples of the opportunities? Well, sometimes games are way too encumbered, for example, right? And when you do the demake, you could either copy the encumbrance, right, unthinkingly, or you could be like, look, this is supposed to be a lighter, fresher version of this game. Let's figure out how to do that, right? So I have never made a demake, I'll say that. Part of that is just because I'm so busy just trying to make other things. But when I play demakes, some of them are really cool and fun, and some of them are just like, there's no point to this, right?
So specifically, I wanted to address the demake thing because as soon as he like wrote that down, I was like, well, it's probably like oversimplifying it to use the word demake, because like all I really mean with demake is that like you should scope the thing smaller. Don't think that you're gonna make this huge thing, right? Small scope is really important when you're an indie, because you just don't have much budget, you don't have much people to do the thing. So like if the games that you are a big fan of are like, I'm a huge fan of Elden Ring, then it's like, well, you're not going to make a game that's as big as Elden Ring. It's just not going to happen. So especially if you're, well, if you're going to be able to make that, but if you're a beginner, then you should know that it's unlikely. But anyway, that was my point with demake. I mean, it's a very good point to say that you need to like understand how the thing works. I mean, to some extent, there was a part in there that I cut. I don't know that if it's in the bonus slides, but there was a part here that I cut. This part that was specifically intended to address this point of like not getting why the thing works. The problem was I didn't have many like examples. I'm not sure why I had this here. Oh, okay, right, because there's games that are doing this kind of stuff, or like pick 3 or whatever. There's just like a lot of games that just do the same thing. They all copy the same design thing, and they're not really even thinking about it. It's like an unthinking thing.
One of the topics that came up was this labor intensive, like he was talking about like core game mechanic, like when you're deciding what your game is about. And it's very helpful if you make it about something that's easy to add to and expand on until you find your game. And that's very good advice. And then he brought up so The Witness is an example of a game that's a little more labor intensive, in that the labor intensive part he was saying in the beginning is another way of saying some of the stuff he was saying later on in the talk about, is something interesting enough on its own, or does it require additional work to be done in order to make it interesting, right? And that's another way of saying labor intensive, is like, to get to the good part, you're going to have to implement more mechanics and more programming and all that. And the thing about point number 2 here is, this really is a beginner versus experienced designer thing. I think if you're a beginner, you want to stay on this end of the spectrum, right? For sure. And then like after you've done at least some simple games, you could start thinking about this, right? But you know, again, as I always say, the thing you got to keep in mind about games is they're way, way more work than you think if you've never made one. And so you don't want to have an idea that's labor intensive, because it puts more stress on that main pain point, right? Of like, it's just so much work. And in fact, when I design games, I mean, this is hard because I have to talk about a game prototype that you haven't played. Like 15 people in the world have played it. It was something, we'll do it after Order of the Sinking Star, so you'll see it eventually. But when I was doing design for that game, I was very, very, very cautious on erring on this side of things. I think in part because I was just tired from working on The Witness and it took forever. And now I look back at some of the decisions I made there and I was like, no, we could go on this side and it would make the game better. So, okay, the thing about doing things that are labor intensive is, because it's harder, a lot of people will shy away from that. And so if you go into that territory, you're going somewhere that other people aren't naturally going to go, right? And it just lets you more easily go into territory that other people aren't entering, right?
Right. So the thing about labor intensive versus what's the word that I used? Well, I just talked about like things that are relatively easy to get new stuff out of versus it's a lot of work for every individual puzzle that you add into the game or every individual mechanic or whatever, right? And the course is just generally targeted at lower intermediate designers, because I think if you're an upper intermediate designer, you kind of already know what you're doing, and you can probably ignore anything that I say that doesn't apply to you. And I try to touch on that a little bit, because I don't want to come across completely like I'm just saying like this is absolutely the rule of how you should always do things. Because everything in game design is like very context dependent, but a lot of the stuff in here is like general rule. It's like the rule of thumb. It's like better than no rule at all. Like it would be better if people tried to pick things that cool stuff is falling out of the system of the game, rather than let's start with, oh, this idea that I have, and like it's going to be so cool once I get all the graphics in there or whatever, right? It's like, it maybe as a beginner that's not the best idea, because maybe it won't be so cool. Like once you're an experienced designer, then you can more imagine like what's actually going to happen. Right. Okay. So this is a question, I think from YouTube. Sunhunter27 asked, Do I think that adding some telemetry for playtest builds can be a good way to get extra value from a CleanX tester? What areas specifically? Well, CleanX tester is specifically about first impressions, and I don't think you're going to get a lot of value from telemetry on first impressions. Maybe you can, but like, I've never put telemetry into a build. I just watch people play the game. Unless you're making a really huge game, you can probably watch everybody play your game that you have test. So something I wanted to clarify that I don't say in that video, but somebody wasn't quite sure about in the pre-screening, but I didn't think it was important enough to like re-edit the video. Is when I talk about rounds of playtesting, what I mean is that as you're working on the game, there's going to be different points where you're like, okay, I have a build that I want people to play and test the game, and so I'm gonna bring on some new testers, right? Like I've made enough changes that I'm going to bring on new testers, and it could be several months that go by, and then you're sort of like bringing on another group of testers. So when I say you like bring on like 3 people, I don't mean you bring on 3 people, period. I mean that you have 3 people, and then you'll have another round later where you bring on 3 more people, right? So in each of those rounds, it's like you're watching those people play the game, and 3 people playing your game, even if you have like a 20-hour game, then that's like a decent amount of time, right? It's 60 hours to watch people play the whole game. And so you don't want to bring too many people on, because you won't be able to watch that. And since I do think if you can watch everybody play your game that you bring on as a playtester in real time, that will help a lot. I've seen people do the other thing where they bring on, we will bring on 1,000 testers and we'll just have people like write what they think. And I think you actually get very little relative to if you only had a few people and you watched what they did very closely. So Patrick GH3, or it's Patrick of Patrick's Parabox fame, asks, specifically for the early development of Taiji, where you showed the builds, how did you make those push, pivot, punt decisions, and why, and how did they turn out in retrospect? Well, when I said push, pivot, or punt, I mostly mean like you're prototyping a new game idea, and the new prototype either goes well or like some part of it kind of works, but it's not exactly the main idea that you had. That doesn't work for some reason, and so you can like pivot onto that smaller part of the idea that was interesting. Or punt, which is just like, this isn't working, and I'm gonna shelve the prototype and not work on it seriously. That's what I meant there. Now, if you meant within the course of developing Taiji, like how did I make the decisions on certain sub parts of that design? Usually I made them really quickly, so there wasn't a lot of like going down a long rabbit hole with a mechanic idea and it's not working. most of the mechanics were like things I tried out on paper, and they were either immediately working or they were immediately not working. And so I often didn't implement anything unless the paper test worked, right? A big thing I think is like in Taiji, there's the like flower mechanic, I guess, right? It's the symbol sort of looks like a flower, right? That was one that actually got cut from the game for a while and then got added in later because I got a lot better at design. And so I started to think like, I think I can make this work now, right? Because it just wasn't working. It was like every single player that went through that section was like getting through most of the puzzles there and did not understand how the mechanics worked. So that's the closest I can think to like answer that question. If there's a good follow-up on that, then feel free to ask it. Let's see. Patrick also asked, specifically for Taiji playtesting, what were some of the biggest, most important insights that you got from the playtesting process, and at what points in development were they? Well, a pretty transformative one, I think, was when Casey Muratori tested the game, and he said that it felt like a game from the 1980s. And that was like the most stark response that I'd gotten of how bad the interface was for the game. And Casey was very much like, oh, you should just walk around on all the puzzles like you do on a few of them or whatever, right? And that should just be how you do the puzzles. Now, that's not what I ended up doing, but it was clear that like, okay, there's something wrong with the way that the game feels. And like, I covered that in the video a bit, but like the main thing at that point was the modal aspect, that you would like go into a mode when you're interacting with the puzzle, and now your normal controls don't work. They do something else, and you have to hit a button to leave that mode. So I gained a lot just by figuring out some way that I could keep the game in the same mode all the time. That's just like, in interface design, that's sort of a concept, and maybe you never heard of that before, but like modal interface just means that, right? That when you're in this mode, the same input might do a different thing, which is just generally not, it can be very powerful, but it's generally not very user friendly. And so you want to avoid that if possible, I think. Okay. Next question. This seems like a very general question, but this was general game design, I guess. Although, let's see. Secret Google Spy says, indie versus finding work in industry, or how do you earn if your first game is probably going to suck? Well, if you've never made a game before, period, then it is true that your first game is probably going to suck. So I think, the kind of common advice of you should try to make a lot of little things really quickly when you're beginning is good, because you don't want to be investing a lot of time into a project that might be a bad idea, and you are so inexperienced that you don't really know the difference between good ideas and bad ideas. But I don't know, like, there's a certain amount of being world wise that is important in the ideas that you choose to pursue, but I don't think you should really be making your decisions based on whether or not they're going to sell well. Like, there's a little bit of that's okay, right? But too much of that, and then you're sort of like stomping out any possibility that you're ever going to do anything interesting because you're just thinking about like the product and how can I like target this product at the right segment or whatever. So like, now the question about versus finding work in the industry. So I've only, as far as working in the industry, I've only worked for Lunar Studios. Otherwise, I've just worked on my own. So I don't know that I have a huge perspective there, because Lunark is also an indie studio. So there are only like 20 people there. So that's still compared to like mainstream AAA game industry or something, that's a pretty small environment. Obviously, you have to like work with people. I think that it's always good to have experience working with other people, so that you know what that's like and you know how to work with other people. But that will probably come either way, even if you're trying to do indie things, right? Unless you're just doing everything on your own, which is probably inadvisable, but is mostly what I did on Taiji, except for Gregory came in the last 6 months and redid the soundtrack and made it much, much better. Jagriff asks, how much of the usability issues with early Taiji versions were you blind to as a designer? Did playtesters complain, or did you just notice that playtesters struggled with it? Playtesters mostly did not complain. If I had listened to playtesters' complaints, then my solution to that problem would have been put the controls on the screen. Because they were like, you know, oh, I guess you told me to read a thing. It has the controls in it, right? Okay, well, you should probably put the controls on the screen, right? That's what I said. There was like Casey was the big one who was like, this game feels, I mean, in the nicest way possible, right? The game felt terrible, right? And that there was no reason for it to feel that way. That he sort of had that perception and was willing to say that. So you'll find that like if something's really bad, oftentimes people don't really want to say that it's bad because they want to be nice. So you do always have to watch out for that. But that's much, much worse if you don't have video, right? Because if you have video, you can see that they're struggling with it at least, right? But, you know, some of the obvious things that would have been obvious in a video, if there were problems with the controls, weren't happening because it wasn't like, oops, I hit the wrong button, right? There wasn't stuff like that. It was just like, it just doesn't feel good. So I guess I would say I was pretty blind to the issues at that time. Now, for context, the game was kind of not initially planned to be a puzzle game, and so this was sort of like a prototype of some puzzles for this sort of Zelda game that was going to have puzzles in it. And so there's a little bit of thinking about that, like there's going to be this whole game and then there's going to be puzzles, so it's not that weird in that context to be like, oh, you're going to go into a mode. Like if you think of you know, the Zelda games, they often will have something like that where you like go into a mode where you're doing some bespoke interface for a puzzle, and it's not so weird because there's so much other things that go on in the game. It becomes more weird in the context of a game where like the only thing you're doing is walking between puzzles. But, you know, it's easy to not reconsider that type of design decision that you make early on. And well, that's the whole reason I bring it up. It's like, it's important to constantly be reconsidering, like, is there some way I can like shift the design and keep most of what I have? Which was the hard part, right? It's like, I don't want to cut things, but solve a lot of these issues, right? If I change the design, maybe all these issues just go away, right? And then I don't have to think like, oh, because that often can be the way that you leap to want to solve a problem, is like, oh, I'll just slap a band-aid fix on it of like, oh, I'll put the controls on the screen every time you like stand at a puzzle, so people won't forget that they have to press the Z key to go into the puzzle, or they won't forget that they have to press the X key to leave the puzzle, or whatever, right? Oftentimes that can be like the knee-jerk response, and like you think, oh, I've solved the problem, but like you definitely don't want to treat that as the way that you solve all design problems, because then you end up with a game that's got a bunch of band-aid fixes on all the issues, and it just feels weird. Okay. So Wilkie B asks, weird question, but if chess were never invented and were released tomorrow on Steam, how would you market a game like this today? Well, I don't think I know much about marketing games. It's not a course on video game marketing. It's a course on game design. So I don't know. I will say that like one of my potential next projects is a weird chess game. So that could be a very realistic question that I have to think about. But yeah, I don't know. I'll just say I don't know and move on from that. Farmer 2729 asks, hi, how do you figure out something if the playtesters didn't complain about it? Well, I think that's part of like building that inverse conveyance skill. I talk a little bit more about that in part 3 of the course, but as like a quick answer to this, I guess, you have to develop the ability in your own self to recognize what the game is actually like and recognize like how you feel when you play it, right? Now, obviously you're extremely familiar with the game, and so problems that come from lack of familiarity with how the design works are hard to see unless playtesters have a problem with it or complain about it. Now, that's why the video feedback, like just watching people play the game, they just record themselves while they're playing, is really important, because oftentimes they won't complain, they won't say anything, and they don't even know that something's wrong to say anything, right? They're just like, this is what the game is like. You know, famously the Joseph Anderson video about The Witness, where he complains about why does the game introduce the polyomino puzzles, not to use the trademarked term and get the lawyers on me, but why does the game introduce the polyomino puzzles mechanic with this really hard puzzle that has these 2 L blocks, and I was stuck on it, or maybe it's an S and L, I can't remember, but like, why does it introduce that that way? So it's like, oftentimes players think their experience with the game is how it's supposed to go, right? And so they might not understand that something went wrong, right? So that's why video is really important there. Okay, null X exception says, how do you make mechanics that synergize together and produce fun, and not just making synergies for the sake of it? Well, maybe that's something that like I'm not quite covering in there super well. I guess I took it for granted that you are trying to make something that produces something that's interesting, that comes out of the, let's say, synergy, which is not really the word that I used, but the things work well together, right? Part of them working well together is that interesting and surprising emergent properties come out of those things working together. You know, that's a point in Jon's little, alongside the the stream discussion there, which I may have to splice in. That's another point where I'm targeting lower intermediate, right? And it's like, it's not the only thing that you can do to make things totally orthogonal. It's just like, it's a good starting point, right? But oftentimes, like, if you make mechanics that don't conflict, like they don't care about the same thing, they're not, you know, they're not looking at this same thing and modifying it in the same way, then it's easy to combine those together, and you will just get some emergent properties out of that that are not the same as each of those things on their own, right? But yeah, the point is that you don't want to just have thing A plus thing B. You want there to be some kind of interaction between those where they multiply and they produce new things, right? I don't know that answers the question of how you do that, other than it's just a property that you should be evaluating when you add things to the game and seeing whether or not it's producing things, right? If it's not producing stuff when you interact, when you put it in there with other things, it really depends on like, how good is that thing on its own, right? Certainly there's things in Taiji that I don't have interact with other stuff. You know, I don't have like tree puzzles plus dice symbols or whatever, right? But it's still okay, and it's worth having that thing in the game, even though like it didn't interact very deeply with that. Or, you know, some of those I didn't try very hard to like make it interact, but like oftentimes if it didn't occur to me that like, oh, this thing could interact with this thing in some interesting way, then maybe it's already past the point of where I'm looking. Like I didn't have to look that hard for the things that were in the game, right? Like even the tree stuff, it was like, that it was just an idea that occurred to me when I went to the cloisters, the Met cloisters in New York City. And I saw this espalier trees that they had there. And it just popped into my head the idea of like, oh, you could make puzzles out of this, because like I'd never seen that before. And so I saw those weird trees and I thought, oh, this is a very weird and artificial structure for a tree. And this is like a way to connect the concept of trees to this very rigid and artificial puzzle thing, right? And so then the whole idea for that area sort of came out of that. But my point is like, there was like serendipity that caused some of those ideas to pop into my head. And then there was also like really obvious interactions that were apparent that were going to happen. And I didn't have to start being like, oh, I really need to dig to get something interesting. Like I could have maybe made a little bit of a bigger game, a slightly bigger game if I started really digging for extra stuff. But I felt like I had enough stuff. There was more stuff than I expected that I would find there. Robotic Fox asks, in cases where the cost of annoyance is worth what the game gets out of it, how do you convince the player to put up with it? Oh, God. How do you convince the player to put up with the annoyance? I don't know, because I haven't tried to design for that. You know, the thing that's popping into my head right now is like Space Giraffe, which is a game that's kind of like that. Or like, well, I did mention Getting Over It, right? Which I haven't played, but, you know, it's a very popular game that I recognize is a sort of annoying challenge to play, right? But I think people like inherently understand in that kind of game that that's just like part of the core challenge of the game, right? So I think you just have to like show what's interesting about your game, right? You have to get to the good part quickly. You have to get to the interesting thing that's worth it as quickly as you possibly can, and don't faff around with a bunch of stuff where the puzzle or whatever, right? The thing that I'm getting is not really worth the annoyance, right? I need to be seeing that, oh, right, there's this thing about it, right? Now, past that, I don't know, other than you're going to have to build a lot of trust with players. You know, you're going to have to like be somebody who's had a career of making games that are great, and then people are willing to maybe stick with the thing longer, even though it's annoying, right? You know, this is like, I can't make Inland Empire, but David Lynch can make Inland Empire, right? It's like, you have to be maybe at a certain point that where the audience has already bought into the thing enough to be like, okay, I'm going to stick with it. Or Hideo Kojima can make Death Stranding, but I can't make Death Stranding, right? Because I'm already bought in. I'm already signing up for whatever bullshit this is going to be, because I just already love Kojima's games, right? So I want to like see what's there. And so then I will put up with the like, okay, this game kind of has a slow start and whatever, right? Because it's like, I assume it's going to be worth it, right? Maybe it isn't in the end, right? Maybe I decide he's all washed up. It's his glory days are past, but like, that's kind of the only way I can see to do that. If it's like your first game, I don't know. Like I said, unless it's obviously a game where you're wrestling with something and that's the point. The examples that I talked about in the course were more like it was an unfortunate side effect of the mechanics of the game. It's like the point. I feel like the point of a little perspective is not to wrestle with the controls, right? It's like that there's something about this perspective thing that's interesting, but it's just like in the time that I played the game, I was wrestling with the controls the whole time on multiple levels, by which I don't mean multiple levels of the game, but multiple levels of abstraction. And I just didn't see anything that was that interesting other than like I get constantly annoyed because I was going to try to do this and now I'm like stuck because of something that I couldn't have possibly seen ahead of time. So it's more like the emergent surprise of that game is a negative experience for the player, not a positive experience. I'm not surprised by the things that I can do in the game. I'm surprised by the things that I can't do in the game. Anyway, okay. Late stage username asks, how do you deal with setting the quality bar too high in the start of your game and not having resources to execute on the rest of it? So I guess you mean like you make a vertical slice or something. I'm not sure what you mean exactly by setting the quality bar too high. Because then that's like presuming that you have a large game and you've chosen a level of fidelity to execute at, and you set that quality, that fidelity too high. You should always try to set the bar for what you're executing on within the realm of feasibility, considering your budget, right? I do think there's a lot that you can do there, right? It's easier to do things now if you don't mind using library assets and things like that. If you're trying to like not do that, then it does get much more expensive, because certainly stuff like art is very high. But I'm not exactly sure what you mean by setting the quality bar too high, because if you mean in terms of the design, my experience is very unusual in that I make games primarily alone. I primarily make games by myself, which means that my budget is pretty low. And I also happen to live out in the middle of nowhere. Luckily, there's Starlink now, so I'm capable of doing something like this without too many technical problems. In fact, there's like an inch of snow outside, so the fact that this is all working, it's should be surprising at all. But my point is that having a very low budget, like burn rate, like how much money does it cost for you to work on the game for a year, gives you a lot more leeway in terms of how high you can set the quality bar, right? Because you're just spending more time on it, right? With that said, having more budget and having more people also is a force multiplier. I mean, that's obviously true, but I've also seen that like when I was working with Gregory doing the soundtrack, right? The soundtrack for Taiji is something that I'm super proud of. I think it's an amazing part of the game, and it was just, the soundtrack prior to Gregory working on the game was sort of an afterthought. There was like, it was okay. I was reasonably happy with the music in the game, but there wasn't very much of it. And I had not prior to that put the energy into it that other parts of the game had. There was not an attempt to like incorporate thematic elements of the overall game design into the music up until that point. And so it was this huge force multiplier to have somebody else that like they can take that on, and that's the thing that they're thinking about 24/7, right? So you can get a lot from that, even though it's much more expensive to have somebody else that you're also having to pay to work on the game, right? Okay. Secret Google Spy. Okay, that was the indie versus finding work in industry question. Okay, so they said, thank you for your previous answer. Do you have some specific skill which you figured out on how to predictably train? If so, what's the Rocky routine? Predictably train? I mean, everything in making video games is kind of like anything else. You just have to like do it to get better at it. So the more you do it, the more you get better at it. As far as like specifics of puzzle game design and puzzle design, those are coming in the next two parts of the course. So as much advice as I can give anybody on that kind of stuff will be there. So I don't think I can say it better here, other than just to say that like you make games, you do things, you want to get better at art, you do art, you'll get better, right? Okay. Valago asks, what do you think about puzzles that make you use something you saw some time ago? Survival horrors have it a lot. You see some magic symbol, and in 40 minutes, you need to match it with something. Do you think it's enough to demand from player to pen and paper it, or is it worth it to build an in-game immersive way to keep this info within context, even though it might take some effort? Or maybe it's better to not have these at all. In other words, am I okay with breaking the fourth wall, requiring people to screenshot or pen and paper the thing, or I must maintain immersion? This is a question that's a little bit too specific in its example. That specific example in a lot of survival horror games where it's like you see something and then 40 minutes later you have to do this, and maybe you forgot to write it down or you didn't realize it was important. And so there's like some genre convention in an adventure game that you should just write everything down. I think that's generally bad design. You shouldn't like rely on genre convention that somebody would know that they should screenshot it or write it down, right? So that thing, if it's required for a puzzle, should be relatively easy to go re-access if you need that information, right? Whether that's for a particular game, or the requirement or the best way to do it is put it into a menu in the game that automatically keeps track of anything that you might have found that's a hint, or whether it's best to do it some other way. I don't know. Like, for example, the way that the Witness does this is when it gives you these things, they're written down on a piece of paper in the game, which is a pretty big hint that maybe you should write it down on a piece of paper. But it still has the benefit of that it's relatively easy to go access those things again, right? You don't have to. It's not like, oh, you went past some point of no return and you didn't write it down. Like you definitely don't want to do things like that. So hopefully that answers the question. I definitely don't think it's a problem for people to write things down or screenshot it. Like I don't even think that breaks immersion. So anyway, let's see. Ois in Car. I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, but Ois in Car asks, when showcasing early versions of puzzle games, have you noticed people approaching things differently? Gore? Maybe that was a typo. E.g. Okay, for example, I found people are more likely to assume things are broken or unsolvable rather than work hard to find a solution. Well, it's certainly true that in any kind of puzzle game, if there's stuff that's broken in the game, the player that's going to infect the rest of the game, and the player is never going to be sure whether or not this is a weird puzzle or is the game broken, right? And if your game's weird enough, people are going to think that anyway. So I just wouldn't worry about that too much, but just try to make sure that things aren't broken. And try to like not put those kind of things that are that weird too close to the beginning of the game, because you need to build player trust to be able to pull off weird things where, you know, there's some odd part of the thing where, oh, you have to like be standing in a specific spot to actually see that. Okay, Kube Runs asks, when a playtester reports a problem, how often do you discuss potential fixes with them? In a more general sense, when talking to playtesters, do you worry about finding a solution too quickly in response to a poor experience? I don't know that I unless I'm absolutely sure that I have no idea what to do, I usually won't discuss it with them. Like, I don't think that it's like, if they're another game designer, it can be useful to discuss potential fixes, but oftentimes other game designers will already have told me something that they think might work. So I don't really have to ask them their opinion unless I have a different idea. And then I want to like run that past them or something. Do I worry about finding a solution too quickly? I don't really worry about it, other than I would say that you shouldn't try to find a solution too quickly. You shouldn't, as John was saying in his live streaming reaction, you shouldn't react, you shouldn't overreact to a playtest, right? Like don't knee jerk and like, oh, I need to change this, right? But no, like if it's possible that you try something you think is going to fix the problem and it doesn't work, but that's going to get like ironed out with more rounds of playtesting. So, okay. Okay, Dark Matter 11 asks, what exactly did you mean by the witness has at its core design idea that seems totally inadvisable to pursue? I know you didn't want to give spoilers, but I'm not sure I understand what that is about and which part of the talk is advising against it. All right, so because I didn't give much of a spoiler warning for this section here, I'm adding an additional spoiler warning here. If you're trying to avoid spoilers for the witness, if you haven't played the witness, then there should be a little timestamp here on the bottom of the screen about where you can skip ahead to. And there should also be annotations on the video. I'll hopefully add those. If you want to skip past the spoiler section, I will also have like a red banner across the top that says spoilers for the witness. Okay, so that's been your warning, and now we're going to go into a spoiler section. This is spoilers for the witness. But I'm talking about environmental puzzles in the witness, and the original idea for the witness was the environmental puzzles. Those were in a prototype that Jon made of a wizard spellcasting game. So there was like, you climbed to the top of the mountain and you saw a path that you took to get up there. And if you drew over that path, then you would learn a new spell that you had not learned from your spell book, right? And like, that was a cool part about it, about the game, but the wizard spellcasting part about the game didn't work. So the entirety of the rest of the game of the witness is sort of an excuse for you to be drawing lines so that you can do this cool environmental puzzle secret lines thing. So that idea seems inadvisable to pursue, because when you are going to be making this complex 3D game with a detailed environment and all that, it just seems like that's going to be a bad experience, because it's either going to be really shallow because there's going to be like 2 of these things in the game, or, you know, what the game is really trying to do is go all the way with it, where it's like anytime you see a circle, it's going to be something that you can draw, right? That seems totally inadvisable, because it's like, there's no way that you're not going to like miss somewhere on this island where you can stand here and you can look in this direction, you can see a thing and it looks like it should be part of one of these puzzles, but it isn't, right? That's just an insane amount of effort to iron out all of those issues in order to make that a good game, right? And of course, when you play the final game, it's totally invisible, right? You don't think about it, right? It's just, this is just how the game is, right? But it's extremely difficult to make that work. And so if somebody was telling me, oh, I think I'm going to make a game like this, I'd be like, okay, good luck, right? And that seems like a dangerous idea to pursue, right? So that level of like effort that's involved in making the design work and making the game good and not be a bad experience is something that generally is inadvisable, right? That I'm advising against it generally. Now, of course, if you are an experienced upper intermediate designer, then you can feel free to disregard that advice. You already know what you're getting into when you're going down that route. Now, sometimes I think the way you can go down those routes is that you just are a little bit naive going into it and you think it's going to be easier than it is, right? In fact, most of the time that's how these things probably happen, is you're just a little bit naive. But all the same, it's like, it's both inadvisable, but it can work, right? Okay. All right, Bortus97 asked, why did I cut the Aboutness from the course? Well, that applies to the next part of the course. But the reason I cut it was because it was a weird word that I felt like I was spending too much time trying to define the word, and I don't even really use it. So why am I defining a terminology that I don't really use when I can just kind of say all the things that I want to say without saying, oh, here's this term that means the thing. It's like I can just talk about the other thing. So that's what happened. That the content is all in there. It's just I took the word out. Okay. So Pale Blue Zebra asks, what's your opinion on procedurally generated puzzles versus handcrafted? Okay. Well, I'm generally of the camp that I don't think that procedurally generated games are overall a good idea. I've seen some exceptions. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but most of the time procedural generation produces slop. It doesn't produce really interesting designs, right? An example of where this does work is Spelunky, and the reason it works well in Spelunky is because the level designs are not the point of the game, right? The point of the game becomes sort of this meta strategy level game thing where like you have to kind of prepare yourself for an unexpected thing that you don't really know, right? And so if you're making strategy games that are like at a next level of abstraction over the details of like individual level designs or individual puzzle designs, then maybe that's a good way to do it, is to try to procedurally generate them. As long as they're like reasonably okay, then that's probably fine. But it's because the focus of the game is now up here and not down here. But like if the focus of your game is like, I want to have a game that has really interesting puzzles and I want the player to have like a good experience with the game, and respect their time and all that, then like procedurally generating the puzzles, maybe not the best idea. With that said, Marcos Don Anthony does really interesting work in this space. So he spends a lot of time specifically working on trying to make procedurally generated puzzle games, and is probably putting more work into that than I've seen anybody else do. So, I do keep an eye on what Marcos is doing, but I don't know whether or not I think that you're always going to end up with like a worse game, at least on that metric, right? Like I said, if you're doing it up here, if you're like, okay, it's a run based game and you're supposed to do a lot of different runs and whatever, then maybe like it could work in some way, but it's just not the kind of thing that I am interested in when I play a puzzle game. So I'm very interested in a very tightly crafted and polished kind of line of communication of ideas that progress through the game. And that's probably not going to happen based on an algorithm, at least anytime soon. Okay. Danny McGee asks, if you have a hidden mechanic in your game, like the way you use an item that isn't obvious and makes it more powerful, should you and how do you introduce that to the player? For example, Animal Well lets you ride the frisbee, but it never tells you this. And it lets you shoot bubbles straight down with the bubble wand. Sometimes these are even required to be puzzles, but the player has no idea they're possible or exist. Well, maybe I will cut this question because I don't really know how to answer this question. If it's a hidden mechanic, then you're not really introducing it to the player. Like that's sort of inherent in that it's hidden. But you can certainly, in that type of situation, you can make a challenge that requires the player to discover the thing, and you can limit the other possibilities, and that will certainly funnel them towards a discovery. But like anytime, that's just the general thing, right? If there's stuff in your game that you want the player to discover, there's like certain things you can do to make that more likely, right? If you can limit the possibilities of things that the player can do other than the thing that they're supposed to do, then that's one way to do it. You can certainly make it to where players don't have to discover the thing at all. to get through the game. That's one way to approach it, but yeah, I mean, generally if people are playing the game, especially if they get into the middle part of a game, they're usually invested enough that they're okay with like experimenting and seeing what they can do, especially in a game like Animal Well, because that's just a game that rewards you for doing that. And the game has a consistent pattern of that. So you sort of, as a player, aren't surprised that maybe there's something you can do with a tool that you have in the game that you haven't discovered yet. And maybe it's worth experimenting further with it, right? Okay, so I'm going to splice in another little bit from Jon's discussion stream here about Metroiding, because I think Jon made some interesting points about that concept that sort of embellished what was a little bit of a throwaway point in my talk, because I felt like, you know, there was something there in terms of the concept of like, how do you get to the interesting part faster, and like making an analogy to the in medias res thing. And all I'll say for myself before we get into Jon's discussion about it is that I think that in medias res kind of sucks a lot of times when you do it. So it's definitely something that if you're doing this kind of thing, you have to be very careful about how to do it. But anyway, enough of me rambling.
The last thing I'm going to say, he brought up this Metroiding thing. I actually didn't know it was called that. I have played very little in the way of official Metroid games. I played the original one a little bit back when it came out at my friend's house who had a Nintendo. I did not have a Nintendo. And I probably played it a little bit, you know, 10 years ago or something again. But I don't think even original Metroid does this, right? Is this like a Metroid Prime thing or something? I never played that. But what I will say about this is I don't like it for two reasons, right? One is a feel reason. It's like a lot of the time what this turns into in reality is that you don't trust the player and you're treating them as a low attention span person, and you're trying to like grab their attention at the beginning in a kind of a cheap way in some ways. I forget what the name of the game is that put me off this, but what's the game where you're like this dude who's like possessed by some evil black goopy tentacle stuff, and you're in New York or whatever game that was does this. Prototype. Yeah, that sounds familiar. I think it was Prototype. It does this in a really extreme way. And I didn't like it comes off wrong, but the secondary reason why I don't like this, and this is a more objective reason, is just that, you know, games have all these mechanics and verbs and all this stuff that you like learn how to do, right? And it's structurally terrible to throw all of that at somebody at the beginning because you're not able to pace it out. And so they suck at all these mechanics. And so you're trying to give them a good gameplay experience because you're giving them all the things that they will be able to utilize eventually, all the tools in the toolbox, but they don't know how to use the tools in the toolbox, and they don't know all the button combos and all these things. And so it's like, tends to be a frustrating, flaily play experience. And then you finally start to get used to it, and then they take it all away from you, and you won't see that stuff for like 10 hours or whatever. It's like, it's structure. And that's bad because you just spent all this time tutorializing somebody on something that now they won't do, and then you'll re-tutorialize later. It's just really confused and messed up. I do think if you wanted to do this, so the reason he brought this up in the talk is because there is the opposite problem too. There's the problem that your game starts too slow. And I think there are more natural solutions to the problem. Just like he said with storytelling, just start people a little later. Give them the first ability. Like, don't just put, yeah, like the initial playtest of Fez back when we were funding Fez was like this too. It was like, hey, we started making some levels. And the levels were literally like pushing crates to get up on the ledge, like every game. Even back in the Fez days, this was already super tired. And it's like, dude, just get to the Fez, right? So like just starting people later, you don't have to treat everybody like they're stupid, right? It's not necessary. There's this, in a way that people are too worried about whether people like them or not, and they'll end up ruining their personality trying to look good to people. There's a game design version of that, right? So just start people, give them the first ability. And if the first ability isn't interesting by itself, either pick a different one first, or why is it in the game anyway, right? I mean, maybe if it combos really well with everything else, but then you would know not to give that to people first if it doesn't have its own thing. So I just think there's more natural solutions to that treat your players with respect eventually.
Okay, so that is the end of the Q&A. Thanks everybody for hanging out. The next part of the course will be premiering next Saturday. If you're watching the video archive of this, the next thing will have already probably premiered. Well, I might get it out before then, but anyway, so it'll be next Saturday, same time. The next one is longer, so bear that in mind. The next one is an hour and 30 minutes. It is the longest part of the course. It's the second part. So thanks again. This all has went really well. We got more questions than I thought I would. And I hope you'll all look forward to the next parts of the course. I will say that I think it gets better as it goes on. So the second part's better than the first part, and the third part is better than the second part. So I will see you around. My voice is getting exhausted, so bye-bye.